All right, we're live. We're back. Once again, everyone, my name is Sunny Ray. This is the Sunny Ray Show. Thanks to our sponsors, GTM Ventures and Raz Rocket. Today, I am joined by Lance Cotrell. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm really excited about this interview. I mean, I am for all my interviews, but this one, yeah, a little bit more so. You have a fascinating background, Lance, and I am excited to dig in. I usually kick off my podcast live streams with like a line or two in terms of the company you're building today. And then I like to put that on ice for a little bit and we come back to it in about 20 minutes. But maybe if you can give people a bit of a teaser in terms of what you're building.
Sure. What I'm working on right now is a program for really helping founders with their fundraising. So I've been producing a lot of content and putting together structures because I've found that seems to be the moment at which founders kind of hit a wall that they can't negotiate themselves. They're experts at building whatever they're building. They know their space, but fundraising is this bizarre mini game that you must win, but is utterly different than everything else you're trying to do.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, we should probably, I'm excited to dig into that. Yeah. But I find the company story falls a bit flat unless people have a bit of context around the founder and the person behind all of it. So I'm really excited. Let's go back a little bit. You grew up in an academic household, correct?
Yeah. Both my parents were professors.
Right. So your father was a physicist and your mother a sociologist. And I think by age 6, you knew you wanted to follow your dad into physics. So what was it about that world, watching your parents as professors, that made a 6-year-old so certain about his future?
I mean, on the one hand, it seemed like they were having a lot of fun. The lifestyle they were pursuing, the kind of things that they were working on really seemed to be engaging. Uh, I mean, the perks of like getting to do a year sabbatical abroad every several years seemed really like a good deal to me. I certainly enjoyed those experiences. But also, I think science and physics just came very easily to me. To some level, it was the path of least resistance, and I kind of just fell forward in that direction over time.
I love that. It must have been a fun household either way. So you went from UC Santa Cruz for your undergrad in physics to UCSD for your PhD in astrophysics. Where like were you literally working with the Hubble Space Telescope? Is that correct? Did I read right there? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And right
Okay.
after it was launched, right? So
Oh,
this was in
wow.
the early 90s. So a lot of the stuff I was doing with the Hubble was before they fixed the optics even. Before they did that repair mission. But because I was doing spectroscopy and we were looking at spectra instead of images, it didn't matter as much. So in fact, most of the observing time went to people like us. So I had one observation that was literally 100-hour exposure with the Hubble.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's interesting. My career began at a company called Quanser, where the founder was a professor that had worked on the Canada Space Arm for many years, and so I was always fascinated by people who work with things in space. So for people who have no idea what that means, can you paint a picture of what your daily life looked like as a young astrophysicist?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of time sitting in front of a computer. You're putting together the observation plans, working with my advisor, because I had a really good advisor who could write. He was a grant writing god, so he's the one who got me all the time on these telescopes. But you're putting together the observation plans, getting the data back from the telescope. Back then, you'd actually get mailed big 9-track tape reels with the data on it that you then load into the computer and write the software to process it, and then try to work out what is that telling you, because we were trying to kind of reverse engineer what was going on in the very early universe. Like Big Bang, very hot, no stars, everything cooled off, and then suddenly the universe gets very, very hot again. Everything gets ionized, and the question was, why the heck did the universe get hot again? And so we were taking these spectra of the gas at these very early stages to see if we could reverse engineer what had made it hot. And so that was a lot of the work we were doing. And of course, a lot of the time you're spending reading articles and trying to stay up on the general space. And then for me personally, I actually got really passionate about cryptography and privacy because there was a lot of things going on at that time as the internet was arriving that seemed like it was going to be a huge issue. So I was also then writing open source cryptography and privacy software on the side, when I probably should have been doing more time on the astronomy.
Uh, so both you and your wife are fencers. I was reading about this, right? So you've been playing also Dungeons and Dragons with friends since 1980s. I was also reading that you did Kung Fu and Tai Chi. What do all these things have in common and how your mind works?
So I think fencing definitely played into the fantasy role playing side of things, right? I mean, I started in '78 when I guess I was 9 years old, so I've been playing for a long, long time, and so fencing was a chance to do sword fighting, and I did fencing in high school, and then my wife and I fenced at Santa Cruz in college. Never particularly competitively, but just it was a good exercise. It was a lot of fun. Um, and we had amazing instructors at Santa Cruz. My fencing instructor there had learned fencing in the French Foreign Legion. This dude named Delmar Calvert, kind of out of central casting. Uh, Kung Fu, that was more of a mental discipline, and I knew I needed some exercise. And I took up Kung Fu shortly after I started my company, Anonymizer, and there's a lot of stress. You're spending a lot of hours. You're sedentary, in a chair, and there's always troubles coming up. You're always on the edge of disaster as a startup. And so having this regular discipline of going out, getting out of the office, getting out of the house, uh, not thinking about work at all, and working up a good sweat, yelling and hitting things was amazingly cathartic. It really helped, I think, me keep my brain together and stay on track through that entire insane process. And we did that for probably 10 years, actually, until we had to move to Northern Virginia from San Diego and couldn't find another instructor in the same style of Kung Fu. So it sort of faded off at that point.
Yeah, interesting. And then while you were deep in astrophysics, the US government was pushing the Clipper chip, essentially a backdoor, right, into everyone's encryption. So you've described that as the thing that struck you as a monumentally bad idea. Was there a specific kind of like news article or conversation that set you off, or was it more of a slow burn?
It was more of a slow burn. So this was kind of an evolving thing. I was aware of the amount of information that could be gathered because, even in the earliest days of the internet, I was started my PhD in '93. What the World Wide Web was invented in '92. We're talking very, very early. Um, but just looking at the amount of information I had in my logs, right? I'm setting up the website for our astronomy group. I'm looking at this. And astronomers are an interesting group because they're up all night at a telescope with nothing to do. So they tend to try to work out what the other people who were observing at the observatory the previous night or the next week have been up to. So security actually was sort of a significant thing for us. But yeah, so the FBI had this idea, the Clipper chip. We're going to put a chip in everyone's computer because security is going to be important going forward, but we want to keep a copy of all the keys. And that's going to get hacked, and foreign governments aren't going to stand for that. They're also going to want copies of all the keys. So this thing just never made any sense. And I was not alone in this. And so I quickly got gathered into with a group of people called the Cypherpunks. And this is sort of a loosely organized crypto anarchist organization dedicated to building as much strong open source cryptography and privacy tools as possible before the assumed next move of the government to outlaw all of that, right? Because there's no point in having a backdoor in the crypto chip on a computer if the bad guys can just use something else. And so we wanted to make sure that that something else was widely available. And I started working on some other people's projects and building things, realized that there was a much better way to do the uh, anonymous email because it was really focused on email at the time. And so I built something called Mixmaster that started to explode. And that's when I realized that I was really more interested in that side of things than I was in the astronomy, right? If there was, you were to look at where my energy was going, it was definitely focused more in that direction. And I wanted it to be useful. And the problem with a lot of these tools that people were building was they were all classic Linux open source projects, right? Step one, untar this and run the makefile on your Linux command line, which sort of meant that, you know, my mom, activists, you know, all the people who actually needed these tools were never going to be able to use them. And so that's when I started thinking about actually starting a company to make this accessible.
Got it. Very cool. Very cool. So I wanted to maybe just switch gears a little bit and ask you. So you've described a very specific kind of breaking point, right? The Hubble Space Telescope data you were using for your dissertation only gave you a signal to noise ratio of 1. Meanwhile, the privacy tools you were building in your spare time were taking off. So I guess, was there like a single day or a week where you woke up and you knew, you're like, I'm done with telescopes. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and kind of taking that leap?
So I'd been talking about wanting to take the leap for several months, but it's, you know, a lot of people talk about wanting to
Right.
start a company, like a lot of people talk about wanting to write a book or something. And yeah, absolutely. The day was, I was driving home from UCSD back to my house, and there was a billboard by the side of the road, and it always had ads for the local shopping malls. It would be, you know, Macy's White Sale or whatever ad that they were doing. And this one day I drove by and it just said University Town Center Shopping Center, http www.utc.com. And I had literally never seen a URL in the wild, right? I mean, I've been building websites for a while. I knew what they were, but not on a billboard. And that indicated to me that it had reached a tipping point, that this was now something that had gone from this niche thing in the academic space to mass market enough that it was worth putting on a sign on the side of the road for people driving by who might then go type it in. And it was still pretty niche at the time, but I just realized as soon as I saw that, that the tipping point was now. We were moving from this sort of niche, small, academic, limited thing to something that was going to transform the world. And the window of opportunity for a business clueless astronomer to jump in and start a business successfully was probably going to snap shut very shortly after. And so basically, as soon as I got home, I told my wife, hey, this is something I really feel I need to do now.
Interesting. That's super cool. So Lance, I was gonna also ask you about a company called, is it called Mixmaster that you'd worked
So
on?
Mixmaster was the open source email anonymity tool that I was building while I was in grad school. So it
Interesting.
was,
Okay.
yeah, so it was pretty sophisticated, right? So when you send an email to someone, it would take your message and break it up into multiple identically sized parts, right? And then encrypt it in layers so that as it went out, it could go through several different hops from server to server to server to server. And in each server, it would get mixed with all the other messages that were being processed. So you couldn't see message in, message out. And because the way I designed it, the messages didn't change size. Like normally, if you're layering layers of encryption, the message shrinks with each hop. The way I designed it, it didn't. So it was always indistinguishable. You couldn't look at a message and know where it was in the chain. And then when it got to the final, what we called a remailer, it would then reassemble all the pieces and deliver it to the final recipient. But it provided really insanely strong anonymity. And but again, not user-friendly. And that's what got me to think about, how do I make an anonymity tool that is easy for people to use? And that's where Anonymizer came from.
Got it. Got it. Cool. Hey, Lance, do you want to maybe do like a bit of a speed run through that point to maybe your current company? I mean, your background is like one of the most fascinating ones I've ever seen. It's but do you want to give people some context so that this problem that the challenge that you're tackling today is a bit more in focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we started off doing consumer privacy because that's where I had come from. So Anonymizer began being internet anonymity. If you're familiar with Tor or VPN
Of
servers, it
course.
basically was that, but before they existed. We were pretty early. And that was really an advantage for me from a business point of view, is there wasn't competition. So I had some time to get my feet under me and learn a little bit about how this process works before I was, you know, getting thrown into a meat grinder. But that worked pretty well. I mean, there was a fair amount of hunger for it. Early adopters really wanted it. So we were able, by 2000 to be probably 1 million active users on the service, about 100,000 paying subscribers. And so the business was going pretty well, but it kind of started to stall at that point because the early adopters had already gotten on board. They highly paranoid people who were really wanting to use a tool to protect themselves. But the vast majority of people weren't willing to take on the inconvenience or pay any money to protect their privacy. I really became very familiar with the idea that people would fill out a survey and say, privacy is incredibly important to me, and then give up everything about themselves for a 10% discount on something, right? And so it is a bit of a paradox around that. But we then went into the dot-com collapse, and that was really a challenging time because all the funding dried up. People were pulling back from the internet. There's a lot of question about whether this thing was really going to work. So we were kind of just holding on by our fingernails for probably a year and a half, like less than 30 days of working capital for a year and a half. It was pretty tight. But fortunately, we did have revenue. We did have customers. And then 9/11 happened, which was the attack on the World Trade Center. And we started thinking, well, how do we contribute? How do we be part of helping address this issue? And everyone was sort of thinking in a very communal way at that time. We built an anonymous tip line for the FBI so that if people had terrorist tips, the FBI's website for terrorist tips was not even encrypted. It was not SSL. And so we said, that's crazy. The people who actually have real tips are going to get killed for going there. And so we built an anonymous front door to that allowed people to securely connect, hide their identity, and provide the information to the FBI. And that processed about 25,000 tips in about 6 months. And we just gave it to the FBI for free. But that, I think, opened doors for us. It kind of to help define us as potentially not as much of a bad guy as they might have thought, because law enforcement tends to be very black and white about things. You're either a good guy or a bad guy. And since they were coming to us with subpoenas on a fairly regular basis, we fit into supporting the bad guys category in their minds. But this, I think, made them rethink it a little bit. And then one of the next times they were out dropping a subpoena at our office, we started talking to them about what they were doing. You're trying to catch bad guys in the real world, but also online. People are doing criminal activities online. How are you avoiding them knowing who you are, right? You can't do all of your investigations in uniform in a marked car, right? There's a need for plainclothes officers. There's a need for undercover activities. What are you doing? Well, they didn't really have a very good answer to that. They weren't doing much. In general, they felt like most people weren't paying attention. And if they were, as I recall, they just used the Wi-Fi at the Starbucks down the street. Said, that's ridiculous. We can do better. And so they actually became our first customer in the government. And within just a couple of years, we went from all consumer to 98% US government. So building platforms for doing online undercover operations for the three-letter guys and the DoD and those kind of customers, which is why I ended up moving to Virginia, because you can't have phone calls with those people. All of the discussions are classified. I had to get a top secret clearance, which was very weird for a privacy guy to go through the deep background checks and get polygraphed and all of those things to get that top level security clearance, so they could talk to me about the things they needed me to do for them.
Fascinating.
And that then exploded, right? I mean, at that point, we were off to the races. I'd raised a couple $1 million from angel investors for the consumer business, but once government kicked in, yeah, we never needed to look back at money again.
Well, that's a nice feeling. And then I guess fast forward to today, Lance, because you kicked this off by saying that something that you're very passionate about is helping entrepreneurs raise capital. So
yeah,
what is it that seems broken? How are you giving back? It almost sounds like so. What's wrong with the way founders are being taught today?
So I think that a lot of the people who are providing the information have very mixed motives. There's a lot of conflicts of interest going on, right? You get a lot of information from the big VC firms that are out there, and the big VC firms are looking for very specific things. And the way they want to drive companies to behave is maximally advantageous to them, but I think generally not as advantageous to the companies themselves. So we took relatively little money. We did not have a unicorn exit, but we also had very little dilution. So everyone was able to do very well with the exit that we had. So I sold the company in 2008 because I realized I didn't know my customers anymore, right? I'm not from the US government intelligence community. I don't really understand that. So we sold to a company that was all former CIA operations people. The entire C-suite had all been CIA chief of station somewhere very interesting. And I stayed on with them as chief scientist for a number of years, but pretty quickly moved out back to California. I'm now up in wine country because I developed a passion for wine and wanted to live on a vineyard and all that good stuff, and got involved in angel investing. So one of the first things I did was I moved here was I joined a group called the North Bay Angels, and immediately sitting on the other side of the table realized a couple of things. One, that all of my pitches were just terrible that I'd ever done, and immediately understood exactly why that communication hadn't worked. And then through that, I started advising some startups locally, just in the community. But I found I really enjoyed working with those people. They're excited, they're interested, they're trying to do new things, they're pushing the frontiers of whatever area that they're in. And that's just an exciting thing to be involved with. And over time, I was working with them on all sorts of things, but I began to realize that it was that moment of fundraising that forced people to reach out for help. Once I'm engaged with people, I often help them on all aspects of what they're doing. But that tends to be the line at which they're suddenly, I can't just, through grit and cleverness, push through this. I actually need some insights, because it is a tricky thing to understand how that other person thinks about it. And of course, communication is what happens in the listener's head, right? It has nothing to do with what you think you're saying, but what they understand. And so founders tend to, especially technical founders, they're in love with their technology, with a product, with the features that they've built, or they're super passionate about the mission that brought them to do this, right? They care about privacy. They care about childhood health care. They care about, some shelters or energy efficiency or green tech or whatever that is, to the exclusion of thinking about the business. And so what I wanted to do was really help people develop that understanding of how do you take what you want to do and make it something that is able to be self-sustaining and successful. Because if you can't make it a successful business, it doesn't matter how much you care about it as a mission. It's not actually going to do the thing.
That goes deep. And so what are some of these tactical pieces of advice or insights, like you said, that you find is unconventional?
So one of the things, of course, is that the VCs, their model is, we need you to be a multi-billion-dollar outcome. In fact, I was listening to a VC on a podcast saying, are we at a place now where a couple $billion exit is considered a failure? I'm like, what kind of insanity? But the size of the checks they're writing, the number of rounds, the size of the companies, it sort of is that with these giant funds, they need every single investment that they make to be able to return their fund. This is something that a lot of founders don't understand, is the whole portfolio model of investing, that I'm going to invest in 20, 30 different companies, each one of which has an 80 to 90% chance of failure. And it's going to take me 10 years to get my money back before you can, have an IPO or an exit or something. And frankly, it's taking much longer now as people stay private forever. And so the simple math is that if I'm only going to have one success and it takes them 10 years to pay me back, and I want to outperform the S&P by some reasonable fraction in exchange for being locked up for a decade and this, insane risk that I'm taking, the ones that succeed have to succeed insanely big. They have to be a decacorn or something like that, especially for the big VCs to be successful, which means they drive this hyper growth at all costs, because merely selling the company for $100 million 5 years later is actually useless to them. It doesn't move the needle. It's inconsequential within the confines of their portfolio. So they would rather have you blow up on a couple percent chance of maybe being able to continue that rocket ship growth rather than taking this off ramp early. And that's where the big conflict of interest, I think, with founders are. Whereas, as an individual selling the company for 20, 50, $100 million, assuming you haven't been insanely diluted, that's a life-changing win for you. But the VC doesn't see it that way. And so making sure you understand why people are making the recommendations they are, how to approach things is incredibly important.
Awesome. Well, thank you. With that, we'll bring this one to a close. We're at the end of our time. Lance, I would love to have you on for a part 2. I got maybe a third through my questions here. Yeah, thank you for all the work you've done over your career and the work you're doing now to help entrepreneurs. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk again.
Yeah, and thank you for, I see there's about 35 people who tuned in for the live stream. So hello to all of you. And until next time, Lance, hang out for 1 minute. Oh, 36 people. Look at that. I'll bring this live stream to an end.